Ever been one of those arguments, where like you are 100% certain you're right?
Oh, yeah,
No question.
absolutely.
It's like, how could they not see it my way?
Yeah.
It turns out our egos
Yeah.
might be the ones stirring up the trouble.
Interesting.
So we did a deep dive into this podcast, Beyond the Ego, and they had this whole episode about relationships. And it really got me thinking.
Okay.
They were talking about how sometimes, like, our need to be right, it actually gets in the way of really connecting with people.
Yeah, makes total sense. It's funny because we think of the ego as this like bad thing, right?
Right.
This negative thing. But it's just a part of us and it's trying to protect us. But sometimes that protection, it can kind of backfire, especially when it comes to our relationships.
So, like, how does that actually show up? What does that look like when our ego is kind of like hijacking our relationships, I guess?
Well, it's that need to be right, even when maybe deep down we kind of know we might be off.
Yeah.
Or like getting super defensive when someone criticizes us, even if like they mean well.
Yeah, or even just like wanting to be right more than you want to understand where the other person is coming from.
Yes, exactly. All of those are classic examples. And these tie into what psychologists call like ego defense mechanisms. It's basically like our mind's way of protecting ourselves from uncomfortable feelings.
Like a protective bubble.
Exactly, like a protective bubble.
But sometimes that bubble keeps other people out too.
Exactly, yeah. And that's where the trouble starts, right? Because it's like we're choosing to protect ourselves, which is understandable, but it can be at the expense of really connecting with people.
Yeah, it's like the podcast said, ego builds walls, love tears them down.
Ooh, I like that. That's good.
But those walls, man, they can be pretty high. Like, what is it about our ego that makes it so hard to just let go and really empathize with someone, especially in the heat of the moment?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? I think it's about empathy, right? Because empathy requires us to kind of like step outside of our own experience
Right.
and see things from another person's point of view. And that can be really tough, especially when our ego is involved.
Especially when you're already feeling kind of attacked or like,
Yeah,
a little bit sensitive.
of course. Yeah, you're already in that defensive mode. So trying to be empathetic in those moments, it's like trying to have a rational conversation with a toddler who's having a meltdown.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Right. It's
Yeah.
like, good luck with that.
It's tough. It's like, just give me a minute.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, but how do we actually do that? How do we wrangle our egos and actually make empathy happen, especially in those tough moments in relationships?
Right. Well, the good news is the podcast had some really great advice on this. And it's not even about like getting rid of our ego completely, you
Right.
know?
Right, because it's there for a reason.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. It's a part of us. It's more about learning how to like manage it a little better so it doesn't turn into a relationship wrecker.
Right. Like, okay, ego, I hear you. You're trying to protect me. But maybe just chill out for a second.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
I got this. And one of the biggest things they talked about was active listening, which I know we hear that all the time.
Yeah, it's like the classic relationship advice.
It is, but it's so much easier said than done.
Totally. Because are we really doing it? Or are we just like waiting for our turn to talk and planning our next brilliant point in our head?
Oh, 100%. That's our ego, right? Just like waiting to pounce back in and defend its little territory. But active listening, it's about like really shutting that voice up.
Yeah.
It's like, putting your ego on mute for a minute and just like really tuning into what the other person is saying. Not just their words, but like, what are they feeling? What's the emotion behind it?
It's like trying to see the world through their eyes for a minute, which is hard. And speaking of hard things our egos don't love, the podcast also talked about apologizing. Even when, like, deep down, you're convinced you're right.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
That is a tough one.
Right. Our ego is like, no way they started it. They're the ones who messed up.
Exactly. But the podcast, they made a good point. It's not about, like, admitting defeat or anything. It's about taking responsibility for the part you played.
Like, maybe you were right about whatever you were arguing about, but you could have said it a little nicer.
Yes. Or maybe your tone was a little much.
Exactly. Like, taking responsibility for how you showed up in that interaction, even if you think the other person was being ridiculous.
Right. It's about saying, look, my ego might be having a full-blown temper tantrum right now, but I care about you more than I care about being right.
That's so good. It's like, I'm choosing our connection over my need to win this argument.
Totally. Which, by the way, is so much easier said than done.
Oh, for sure.
It takes some serious self-awareness to even catch yourself in those moments, which is another thing the podcast talked about, actually. like being aware of your triggers, you know?
Yes. Like what sets you off.
Yeah, and sometimes it's like the smallest, stupidest thing. You're like, why am I losing my mind over this?
Totally. But that's our ego, right?
Yeah.
It's so good at latching onto these tiny things, but it's usually about something bigger, something deeper.
Right, it's like old baggage resurfacing, you
Yeah.
know, old wounds that haven't quite healed.
Exactly. And being aware of that is huge because then you can start to separate, like, okay, is this really about the dishes in the sink?
Or is this about that time someone made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like 5 years ago?
Exactly. And once you can see that, you can choose how you want to respond.
You can choose connection over defense.
Exactly. And the podcast ended with two, like, almost like superpowers when it comes to taming your ego:
Okay, hit me with it.
gratitude and humility.
Ooh, I like those. I love that. Okay, gratitude and humility.
Yeah. And it's so simple, but when you're in it, it's so hard.
Right.
Because, like, when you are focused on what you appreciate about the person, it's really hard to be angry at them at the same time.
It's such a good point. It's like it just shifts your whole perspective.
Totally.
Instead of like, look, they did this again. It's like, but they also do this. And I love that about them.
Exactly. Exactly. And it kind of ties into humility, too, because humility is about recognizing that we don't have it all figured out, you
Yeah.
know? Like,
Right.
maybe we aren't always right.
Which is a hard one for the ego to swallow.
Oh, yeah. Ego does not like that, being wrong.
Oh,
But humility, it allows us to be more open, more curious. Like, maybe we can actually learn something from this disagreement.
that's good. Instead of it being like a battle, it's like an opportunity.
Right, exactly. It's a learning opportunity. And speaking of learning opportunities, the podcast actually shared this story about a couple who were, like, really struggling. I think they were about to call it quits. Yeah, it was bad. They were just, like, constantly fighting, and their egos were, like, at war with each other.
Locked in a battle royale.
Yeah. They were both feeling completely, like, unheard, unappreciated. It was rough. But they started seeing a therapist, and the therapist helped them to see how much their egos were actually, like, sabotaging their relationship.
So they were able to like start applying some of these things, these tips,
Right.
like in real life.
Yeah. They started practicing active listening. They started apologizing more, even when it was hard.
Wow. That's brave.
Yeah.
And did it actually work? Like, did it actually help?
It did. I mean, it wasn't like an overnight miracle or anything.
Right.
But little by little, they started to understand each other better,
Yeah.
And they learned how to deal with their disagreements with a lot more empathy.
It's amazing how like such small changes, these little shifts in thinking can have such a big impact.
They really can. It's not about, like, learning some magic communication tricks. It's more about, like, a fundamental shift in how you're approaching the relationship. It's like, are you choosing to be right, or are you choosing connection?
Right. Yeah. And when you put it like that, it's like, well, obviously I want the connection.
Right, exactly. But our egos don't always make it easy.
And it makes me think, like, if that's how much our ego shows up in our close relationships, like, imagine if we applied these same principles
Yeah.
to, like, all of our interactions.
Oh, man, that would be a game changer.
Right. Like, think about it. The people we disagree with online, that person who cuts us off in traffic, even just, like, a stranger at the grocery store.
Totally. Everyone's dealing with their own stuff, their own insecurities, their own egos.
Right. Everyone's fighting a battle we know nothing about.
Exactly. So, like, what if instead of instantly going into defense mode, we just, like, paused, took a breath, and tried to see things from their perspective for a second?
Yeah.
Like, even just that tiny shift in perspective, it could make such a difference.
It's like that saying, be kind. For everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle.
That's so true.
So maybe this is something to like keep in mind as you go through your day. Try to notice those moments when your ego is like trying to take the wheel
Yeah.
and see if you can gently guide it back towards understanding, back
Yeah.
towards connection.
I love that.
Because let's be honest, the world could use a little more of that right now.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, thanks for diving in with us today. Until next time.